With the relatively new increase in popularity for generative AI, one of the interesting questions that revolves around education and the education system is, what is the impact of generative AI on plagiarism and plagiarism detection? We're actually going to explore that topic in today's paper, which is titled, Will ChatGPT Get You Caught? Rethinking of Plagiarism Detection. This was written by Mohammed Khalil and Khalil Er. Apologies if I mispronounce any names. Here's the abstract for the paper. Quote, the rise of artificial intelligence, AI, technology, and its impact on education has been a topic of growing concern in recent years. The new generation AI systems, such as chatbots, have become more accessible on the internet and stronger in terms of capabilities. The use of chatbots, particularly ChatGPT, for generating academic essays at schools and colleges has sparked fears among scholars. This study aims to explore the originality of contents produced by one of the most popular AI chatbots, ChatGPT. To this end, two popular plagiarism detection tools were used to evaluate the originality of 50 essays generated by ChatGPT on various topics. Our results manifest that ChatGPT has a great potential to generate sophisticated text outputs without being well caught by the plagiarism check software. In other words, ChatGPT can create content on many topics with high originality as if they are created by someone. These findings align with recent concerns about students using chatbots for an easy shortcut to success with minimal or no effort. Moreover, ChatGPT was asked to verify if the essays were generated by itself as an additional measure of plagiarism check, and it showed superior performance compared to the traditional plagiarism detection tools. The paper discusses the need for institutions to consider appropriate measures to mitigate potential plagiarism issues and advise on the ongoing debate surrounding the impact of AI technology on education. Further implications are discussed in the paper, end quote. If I had to summarize this paper into a single sentence, I say that this paper explores how likely it is for plagiarism software to detect whether an essay was written by generative AI. Now, this topic is broad enough that it's relatively interesting for many educators in many different domains. However, I'm going to talk about this specifically in relation to computer science and computer science education, in particular with code generation. Now, if you don't know who I am, my name is Jared O'Leary, and I have a background working with every single grade level, kindergarten through doctoral student in music education and computer science education contexts. If you want to find out more about my background, just go to my website. It has my curriculum vitae, which, speaking of, there are hundreds, if not thousands, of free resources on my website, jaredoleary.com, which has over 180 podcast episodes for computer science educators and a bunch of other content on there for gamers and drummers, etc., because I like to create content. So check it out if you haven't already. Now, this paper is relatively short. We're going to get through it fairly quickly. However, it raises some interesting questions that I think educators should explore, especially computer science educators. So in the background of this paper, the authors talk about, well, what are chatbots in education? What specifically is ChatGPT? How do we engage in detecting cheating and proctoring, etc.? And then what is like a plagiarism check? So if you're interested in learning more about that, feel free to check out this paper. It is available for free, and I do link to it in the show notes at jaredoleary.com. But in the second section, the methodology, the authors talk about how they generated 50 essays on different topics. And so these were 500-word essays on a particular topic. These were generated by ChatGPT. The essays were then sent to two different plagiarism softwares. So one of them is Turnitin, and the other one is Authenticate. 25% to the first one, 25% to the other one. However, they also took the essays and they sent it to ChatGPT and asked, hey, was this created by AI or was this written by a person? And they did that for all 50 of the essays, which was a great thing to test, whether or not generative AI could actually detect if something else was created by generative AI. All right, so let's talk about the results here. So the very first one is results for the Authenticate software. Again, there are 25 essays that were submitted to Authenticate. So the results here are based off of how likely it was to detect whether or not these were created by generative AI, or rather, whether or not it was marked as plagiarism. Here's a quote from page 8 of the PDF. Quote, the majority of the essays, n equals 17, 68%, were found to have a high originality as they were barely similar to other content, less than 10%. Some of the essays, n of 25, 20%, had an acceptable level of similarity ranging from 10 to 20%. Only 3 essays were reported to have very high similarity, 20 to 40%, with other content. And none of the articles were found to have similarity score above 40%. The average similarity score across all essays was 8.76. From the first result set, it is clear that the essays generated by ChatGPT contained highly original content and would not face plagiarism issues if they were student submissions for an assignment, end quote. Okay, so they basically found that the majority of the essays were not similar to other forms of writing that were detected by this particular system. So in other words, it would bring it back and say, hey, it's likely that whoever submitted this did not plagiarize this or lift this from somewhere else. But what about the second plagiarism software? So this one was a little bit higher. So this one is the software called Turnitin. Quote, at first glance, it is evident that the similarity scores were relatively higher among the second group of essays. To begin with, nearly half of the essays, n equals 12, had a similarity score of less than 10%. And 6 essays exhibited an acceptable level of similarity, with scores ranging from 10% to 20%. In comparison to the first result set, where only 3 essays had similarity scores between 20 to 40%, a significant increase in instances of lack of originality was observed in the second set, with 6 essays displaying problematic similarity scores. Additionally, a striking case of plagiarism was identified in one of the essays, as it displayed a high similarity score of over 40% with other existing content. The average similarity score among all essays was found to be 13.72, representing an increase over the initial result set, 8.76. End quote. That's also from page 8. Now, while this is certainly better than the Authenticate software for these 50 different essays, it's still likely to pass the plagiarism test. So students who use ChatGPT could have submitted these 500-word essays and likely have not had it detected by both of these softwares. Okay, but what about when it was reverse engineered with ChatGPT itself? So asking it, hey, was this text generated by a chatbot? Quote, with an accuracy of over 92%, the ChatGPT was able to detect if the written essays was generated by itself. Out of 50 essays, ChatGPT identified 46 as being plagiarized, with 4 remaining undetected as instances of plagiarism, end quote. So in other words, 46 out of the 50 were labeled as plagiarized or as written by a generative AI. So it performs significantly better than the plagiarism checks. Plagiarism is the idea that you are lifting something from somebody else without giving credit to them. Sometimes it's in the form of an overt, I am literally copying and pasting what somebody else wrote and just putting it in here without citing it. Other times it might be I'm paraphrasing these ideas and I'm putting it into my own words, but I'm not necessarily pointing back to the original source to say, hey, here's where I got this idea from. It appears as though ChatGPT is not directly lifting from other sources by literally just copying and pasting ideas from one source and putting it into another without actually citing it. Instead, what it is likely doing is paraphrasing from other forms of text, a lot of different forms of text, and kind of synthesizing and summarizing and putting it into something new. Where this becomes a problem is it's obviously not pointing back to where it got this from. So instead of embedding in-text citations or things like that into it, it might be making it as though the person who submits this is coming up with this on their own. These are our original ideas. But this leads to a question of, is this a form of plagiarism or just kind of the new version of getting someone else to write the essay for you? Let's say that the next version of ChatGPT, 5 or even 6 or whatever, is able to add in references and citations. Is that actually a form of plagiarism? Or is it an entirely different question that's more related to what people have previously done, where they will literally pay someone to write an essay for them? Having taught at higher education institutions, I know that there are several professors that I've worked with who have talked about how they would sometimes have students submit in just terrible work, terrible work, terrible work, terrible work. They get to the final end and it's holy cow, this could be submitted for publication immediately. It is phenomenal. And because they had a long history of just really bad work, and then suddenly it was amazing, it was okay, clearly you hired somebody to write this, because when they asked the student to come in and explain, what did you mean here by this particular very dense paragraph, the student's not able to actually articulate it. Okay, clearly you don't understand what you even wrote or claim to have written, so odds are you paid somebody else to do that. So let's talk about academic integrity and how that might impact whether or not you actually finish this degree. This might be a new form of that, in that students, if they are able to add in citations into the generated text, now it's no longer a form of plagiarism, but it's still a form of academic dishonesty and a lack of integrity. So it's something that we as educators really need to kind of think through and prepare for. But speaking of, the authors give on page 12 some recommendations for educators, as well as recommendations for students and institutions. So the first recommendation that they give to teachers is to go beyond the basics and actually have active engagement that requires critical thinking. I totally agree. We shouldn't be wasting our time all doing the exact same thing and having the same outcome. Instead, we should be engaging in projects that actually have an impact on our community or the world outside of the classroom, instead of everybody writing the same essay on the same topic and the teachers just grading for grammar and whatnot. That sounds terrible. From a computer science perspective, it's the same thing. We shouldn't all be creating the exact same calculator app. How about instead we create different games and apps and other things that are actually interesting to the students that are working with it, instead of everybody recreating creating the exact same thing that has one single solution. Another thing that the authors recommend is that teachers could actually talk to some of the students about the limitations of ChatGPT and some of the consequences for actually relying on it. There's consequences in terms of like not actually knowing the material. Like if you're studying this, let's say for higher education or something, and you're trying to get a degree in a particular topic and you rely entirely on generative AI to figure out things, when you get to a job interview and they ask like about your subject area expertise and you're not able to articulate that, it doesn't matter how good your like academic qualifications are on your CV. They're going to look at you and go, you clearly don't know what you're talking about. Sorry, you're not going to get hired. But there's also the issue of, again, academic integrity. Like if you actually go to an institution and submit plagiarized work or get somebody else to do the work for you, or are just dishonest in some way, then you could very much so get kicked out of the institution. I've had to have that conversation with a couple of students where it's like, hey, if I were to actually go through the list of steps I'm supposed to take when you do this very specific thing, you'd be kicked out of this university. So students need to be aware of like, yeah, this could save you time, and it'll save you even more time in the long run because you won't have any homework to do because you won't be allowed back in the institution. And maybe that's something they actually want, but probably not. So it's good for students to know that, which relates to the third thing, which is like you really got to focus on academic integrity with the students that you're working with. And that's something that you can put in the syllabi that you create. Okay, now for students and whatnot. So one of the things that the authors recommend is to take advantage of this technology to improve your own learning, your own competencies, etc. But don't use this as a substitute for original thinking, writing, creating, etc. Use it to maybe generate some ideas of potential essays or programs that you could create. And then actually, do the work to do that. And then they advise students to, again, focus on academic integrity. Now, from an institutional standpoint, the authors recommend that institutions actually get more familiar with the potentials for large language models being used, generative AI, etc. This is something that teachers K through doctoral should really start focusing on now because this is now a thing. So they recommend that institutions create and implement very clear policies and guidelines because this is now a part of our reality in the education system. And one thing that you could also do is to offer training for like various students, faculty, staff, etc. about not only academic integrity, but also like how to use AI responsibly in the classroom, like as a tool for education or for learning, which we'll actually talk about in next week's episode. So there's a little teaser for you. Now, at the end of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes, I'd like to share some of my lingering questions and thoughts when reading through these particular papers. So one of the questions that I have is, how are you using or planning on using generative AI to help you teach or to help students learn? There are so many content creators out there right now talking about how they're using generative AI in their real estate portfolio, or to find a great vacation destination and things that you could do in that destination, or to learn something new, or to help them get out of a parking ticket, whatever. Like there's many different uses that people are talking about online, some of which are related to education. Like some educators are actually using generative AI to come up with writing prompts or lesson plans, etc. So if you're currently using it, I'm genuinely curious how. And if you're not using it but are planning on doing it, what are your plans? You can respond on the show notes at jaredoleary.com or even in the YouTube comments. It'd be really interesting to see how people are using AI or planning on using it in the education system. But another question that I have is, what concerns do you have about generative AI in education? And what excites you about it? There's a lot of really cool things that can be done with generative AI in education, but there's also some pretty scary things that some educators are pretty concerned about. Again, you can post on the show notes, or you can post on the website, jaredoleary.com, or you can post in the YouTube comment section. And I'm happy to talk about these and kind of share some of the comments that you leave in those different places in upcoming episodes, because we're going to be talking about AI for a little bit for the next couple of episodes. But a little bit more of a deeper question that I have is, where is the line for you with plagiarism when using generative AI versus other sources like Stack Overflow when it comes to programming? So for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, Stack Overflow is kind of like a Ask Jeeves for programming. So you can go to this website, you can ask a very specific programming question, maybe even put in your own code, and then other people respond to it and give like, here's how to do X, Y, or Z, or here's how to fix that problem that you're having with X, Y, and Z. So often, programmers, and including myself, would go there whenever they're stuck using a new IDE or a new language or whatever, and are trying to figure out, how do I do this very specific thing? You go into Stack Overflow and you can look at it and just copy it and then paste it into your program, maybe change a few of the parameters, a few of the variables, some of the function names, etc. But in general, leave a large portion of that intact, and then voila, you have a functioning program, or it just completely broke and made things even worse. But hey, version control. So when it comes to something like that, specifically with programming, At what point do you think that it's plagiarism? When you are using Stack Overflow or when you're using generative AI? Or is it both or neither? Is that just simply part of the process and what you consider to be part of being a programmer? I certainly know that there's a lot of people who feel that way. I mean, there's a ton of memes about it. But another question that I have that's a follow-up is, how does that compare with your thoughts on other forms of plagiarism? So plagiarizing an essay or a song. So for example, if somebody were to directly lift like an entire paragraph from an essay or from a paper or whatever, and then put it into their own, that's clearly a form of plagiarism if you're not citing that work. But when you take an entire function or like set of code, could be pages long, and put it into your own program, that's generally considered acceptable because it solves a particular problem. There might only be one way to solve that with that particular language in that particular IDE. It depends on how specific and complex the problem is. So even if you hadn't copy and pasted from somebody else, you would have ended up with very similar or the exact same code. So again, is that plagiarism for you? Now, when answering these questions, were you focusing on the process or the product? And how does thinking of either of those actually impact your answer? Now that I've kind of pointed it out, the process versus product dilemma that is often discussed in education, if I ask you to focus on the process, does that change your answer? Versus if I ask you to focus on the product, does that change your answer? So for example, if you focus on process in general, which is something that I certainly focused on in the K-8 coding classes that I worked with, do you care more about the effort expended to create a product? But if you focus on the product, do you care more about how efficiently time was spent creating that thing? From an entrepreneurial standpoint, we might look at this and go, this student who used ChatGPT is being more efficient with their time, and they're potentially going to be able to start several businesses or whatever, or create several different apps in the amount of time it would have taken somebody to, from beginning to end with a blank slate, create an entire app, a single one, as opposed to several using generative AI. In a school context, we might punish the person who used generative AI and reward the person who spent all their time starting with a blank page from start to finish and created everything from scratch without using any kind of hints. But an entrepreneurial side of things, from a business side, we would likely reward the person who creates several different apps. The odds of them being able to make more money off of the several different apps versus one app is something that we need to consider. So how we set up our classes to either reward or punish one form of engagement over another can make it so that some students are going to really thrive in a classroom context or really thrive outside of the classroom context. In other words, are they likely going to want to leave the formal education system because they know they will be rewarded outside of that system if they were to actually just go out on their own and start their own business ventures? These are things we have to consider as educators. We can't just focus on like what students are learning, but also the social context outside of the classroom. It doesn't mean that you have to change your practices in order to match what is going on in a capitalistic culture, but instead to be able to acknowledge it and discuss it and talk about, well, even though you understand how that will be rewarded outside of the classroom, students need to be able to understand why it is important to engage in this process in another way. But if you don't have that dialogue, a student's going to look at this and go, what's the point? This is wasting my time. This is busy work. Why would I focus all my time doing this one thing when I can literally get rewarded for this outside of this formalized context? I should just quit this class and go do this thing and start my own company venture or whatever. These are just my own ramblings on generative AI and whatnot, but we're going to talk about this more in the upcoming episodes, and it's something that we've actually talked about in other episodes. For example, in episode 13, AI for All, Curriculum Development and Gender Discourse with Sarah Judd. In episode 142, Teaching AI in Elementary School with Charlotte Dungan. Episode 173, Empathetic Listening in Computer Science with Josh Sheldon. And in episode 176, The End of Programming. I link to all these in the show notes at jaredoleary.com. So if you haven't listened to those episodes, check out those interviews, and there's a bunch more that are really cool, as well as a bunch more of these Unpacking Scholarship episodes. If you enjoyed this episode, consider sharing it with somebody else or leaving a review or simply a comment or a like on YouTube. It just helps more people find it. Stay tuned next week for another episode that kind of dives into this topic a little bit more with a study that kind of compares, well, what happens when students use generative AI to learn how to code compared to students who do not use it? Do they learn as much or do they learn less? Or is it the same? You'll find out next week. Until then, I'll hope you're all staying safe and are having a wonderful week.